So I grew up in Nebraska. We moved here from Virginia, where I was born. My dad was a professor. He taught at Virginia Tech. And we moved here in 1976, I think it was, right before I started first grade at May Morley Elementary School here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So for my mom, who is a native Nebraskan, it was coming home. She grew up in Elwood, and my great-great-great-grandma, three greats, was one of the first women homesteaders out here in Nebraska. And she was an amazing woman. I wrote an article about her when I was still freelancing before I wrote my first novel. Her name was Zuba Moncrief, and she walked 17 miles to stake her claim in Gosper County and walked 17 miles back. She was a widow with 4 children. So that's on my mom's side. So she's very much a native Nebraskan. My dad is from Seoul, Korea. So I have 2 worlds that I'm combining, but I did grow up here. I went to Lincoln East High School. I went away for college and came back, and I've been here ever since. And today I live south of Fremont on a farm. I'm married to a farmer. I have 4 stepchildren. And I write up in the old part of the old 1940s farmhouse upstairs, so yeah. So I do consider myself a career writer. I was working for the Gallup organization up until about 2010 or 11 when my book career started taking off. And at that point, I had been editing on planes and finishing manuscripts in hotel rooms and while going overseas. And it got to the point where I either had to, pick one and continue to be a consultant or go this way, take a new contract I'd been offered and continue writing. So it was not a hard decision, but the one thing that was kind of hard was giving up my health insurance. So that was kind of a heart-patterning moment for me, but it was an easy decision in the end, and I haven't looked back, and so I've been a full-time author ever since. So after May Morley, back in the day, in the early 80s, Lincoln East High School was 7th through 12th. So I attended junior high and high school at Lincoln East, and then I went to Smith College and did a stint, summer school at Oxford University. Wow. Not English, though. I studied English at Smith. I studied economics at Oxford, which is so not my, I don't have that part of the brain. So that's what I did for school. Well, I will never forget visiting the state capitol as a young person and seeing the busts of Nebraska authors in the Capitol in the Hall of Fame. So Willa Cather, of course, but I think there's at least 3 women authors in the Capitol, and I never forgot that. And I remember reading My Antonia. I remember reading Plains literature growing up, and so that was always just a part of my growing up and my heritage. I have to say, first of all, teachers. So in grade school at May Morley, and I never knew her first name because you never know your teacher's first names, but there was a Mrs. Bush who told me to write my first article when my beloved dog, Oliver, an English bulldog, passed away. So I wrote an article about him and it was published. So I was published at a young age. In high school, Ann Cunard, who is still living here in Lincoln, Pat Kaltenberger, 2 of my English teachers. At Smith College, Craig Davis, and also Daniel Mueller from the University of New Mexico. I studied under him in the summers. But I have to say also, my father, who was a professor at UNL for many years, I had just come back for spring break during my freshman year at Smith College. And I was having a conversation with my dad about how great books are like roller coasters with their twists and turns, and talking about one of my favorite books. And during that conversation that day in the car, I blurted out to him, I think I'd like to write a book. And I was supposed to work at NBC Bank, which is just down the street, used to be, from where we are right now. And I had already done that one summer. And once again, I don't really have the number thing going. I wasn't a great teller, but I was supposed to do it again. And that day, my dad said, okay, Tosca, I'll make you a deal. I'll pay you what you would have made working at the bank if you write your first novel this summer, do it full time, and treat it like a job. And that was a no-brainer. So that summer, this was 1989, I wrote my first novel instead of working at the bank. So my dad changed my life that day with that simple conversation.
Yes.
So I'd say him, and then also my husband Brian. He's the one that I can always count on for brainstorming and support and to remind me to have fun. You know, it's really, I think if you ask any author that, there's always times where they weren't quite sure if they were an author or a writer, even if they were published, because most writers I know deal with imposter syndrome on a daily basis. So it's a slippery scale between delusions of grandeur and paranoia, and usually you can slide back and forth in the space of, you know, a minute. So, you know, after I'd had a couple books out, after I quit my job and was doing it full time, then, you know, it occurred to me, okay, I'm really doing it now. So, but there's still moments where I think, you know, is this for real? Am I really doing it? And, you know, every day you deal with that. I've always needed stories. So when I was young, I made up stories. Way before I ever wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a ballerina. And so ballet for me wasn't just about the aesthetic or the art of ballet, it was about telling stories on stage. And so I used to perform in the Nutcracker here in Lincoln, at the community playhouse before we had the Lead Center. And so I always needed stories. And that's why I love movies. That's why I love reading books. That's why I love a great TV series. So I don't know if it was always writing. I loved stories in many different forms. So this is a funny story. I had 2 books left in a contract with Simon & Schuster. So I went to New York to meet with my publisher, and I had a short list of 10 ideas or concepts that I thought would make fun stories. One of them was a young woman leaving a cult and having to start over in the outside world that she's been taught to regard as evil. And the other one was based on this news article I had read about a reindeer carcass that had thawed in the Siberian permafrost. And when it did, it happened to be infected with anthrax, and a nearby village got sick, very sick, and a young boy died. And I thought, this is horrifying, and also kind of fascinating. And so that was on my list as well. And so when I took the list in, my publisher said, I like this one, and I think you should combine the 2. And I thought, how is that going to happen? But being the good writer soldier that I am, I went home and set to work, and that was the inspiration for those books. And the fun thing about those 2 books for me is I was able to set them in the Midwest, here where we live, for the very first time in my life. So I kind of had a field day with that. My best way of working is in long periods where I can be totally immersive, because I'm not good at shuffling around and doing different things. I'm not good at that. And so this is something I learned my dad does too. My dad wrote many books during his career, and so it was kind of comforting to hear that he also worked the same way. So long periods of time, I used to write late into the night, into the wee hours. That changed after I got married and acquired my children, and also after turning 50, it's been a lot harder. So I try to do more during the day because it's not the same. Well, research is something that if you would have asked me a long time ago, I would have thought, no, that is not my cup of tea. That's not something I would ever enjoy. But research is something I absolutely love. And you can get off on so many rabbit trails researching that you forget about the writing and have to finally come back and remember to do that part. So, you know, I've learned to consult experts. And that really shortens the process because they can point you towards great resources. I give the research the time that it needs. So I've given 18 months full time to research for my novels before. I've given you know, months at a time for novels before. And I try to really enjoy the process. And one thing that I always do is I research before I outline, because the research informs the outline, because there's so many things you may not know about, and you think, well, this changes everything. So Yeah, so for the line between, my sister, Amy Lee, who also attended East High School here and now lives on the East Coast, is a physician, and she teaches medical school. So this is the story also. The line between is about a young woman who leaves a cult right as a pandemic is about ready to explode. And so my sister helped me with the research for the disease for that. Beyond that, a lot of research into pandemics and when the next one could be. And of course, I wrote this right before COVID happened. So once again, delving into the world of what could be and kind of getting lost in there and then picking out the pertinent parts and going off to write. I write for readers who are ready to go on yet another journey with me. And so this drives people like literary agents crazy when you're an author like me who wants to write over here for a while, write over here for a while, and now, do a World War II story, which I just finished. And so a lot of people in the business may not like that, but I write to entertain my readers. And so I'm writing for readers like me and people who have read my other stuff and who've enjoyed it and want to go on one more adventure with me. I get asked a lot, what do you hope in this book or this book that your readers will take away? And my number one answer to that is always a great time. I don't want to get prescriptive about what they take away or what has meaning to them, because the things that readers take away from a story, they have everything to do with what the reader brought to the story, what they're going through, what they're living through right then, and their reasons for coming into that adventure. So I always hope, first of all, that they will be entertained, that they will feel like they were in good hands through that story, and that their money was well spent on that book. And I hope that they'll want to go on another one. So every book I've written has changed me or challenged me in some way or another. So for instance, my second novel, which was Hava, the Story of Eve. So this is biblical fiction about an Adam and an Eve and their life together and what that could have looked like. And I wrote this story while I was going through a divorce. And so I think that really impacted the way that story went. And so there's always part of your own life that's a snapshot in that story. And you can't go back and write it the same way. It will never be the same. You could never do it the same because you can only do it based on what's going on in your life at that time. I wrote a story about Judas Iscariot, the infamous betrayer of Christ. And I write in first person a lot. And so when I go into the writing for something like that, in that case, I went into it saying, you're a first century Jewish man, you're a first century Jewish man. But about a third of the way through the novel, as he was struggling with his own activism and with his agenda that he had for this new friend of his, this Jesus friend, and for the agenda that he had for God and the way he thought God should act, I realized I was writing my own story. And so it became very personal. And so every story becomes a part of your life, and a part of your life goes into every story in ways you never expected. I've had readers write to me with different stories through the years. I had a reader write to me and say, after reading your first novel, Demon, a Memoir, I wrote to my ex-wife and I wrote her a long letter, and then I condensed it down to just 3 words: I forgive you. And I can't really attribute that to anything that I did in the story. Like I said before, I think what readers take away from a story has to do with what they go to the story with. I do think there's also, I think every artist is communing with the divine in a way. And so I feel like writers are just a part of the process. So how it's impacted them, I only know from the stories that I hear. I hope that they've been inspired, and I hope that they've enjoyed their time. I would say do it first for yourself. Write what you love. Be tenacious about it. It can take years sometimes. I mean, there are Cinderella stories, but it can take years sometimes before you get that break and get published. I would say also that before you're published, you're writing in a very protected, safe space. You're not being criticized. You're not being ranked on Amazon next to a blender. So take that time and write with all the audacious moxie that you can summon, because you're going to, feel yourself wanting to shut down or censor or whatever later on. So train yourself to be bold from the start. There's a reason why my #1 rule of writing when I teach writing is write like no one will ever read it. And that's the way we should all write, as though no one will ever read it, and we're not concerned with these other voices going on. So that's my first line of advice always. I do have a World War II book coming out next year with Marcus Brotherton, so that is not something I really saw coming. It was a surprise that kind of came along. I'd like to continue to try new things and tell new stories, and even tell some stories that I might not have thought about telling even a few years ago. I am a board member of International Thriller Writers, and I do love the thriller genre, so I'd like to continue to write some suspense and thrillers, but I have to admit that I do have a soft spot for history, so I'm sure I'll be going back in history. In fact, the new project I'm working on is a medieval thriller, so cool. One of each, so yeah. The very best part, okay, there's several great things about being a writer. One is working in your pajamas, which we all got to experience during COVID, but that's something that I enjoy every single day. I'm not really good at routine, so the fact that I can wake up and decide that day how that day is going to go is great for me. But the very best part of being a writer is being invited into somebody else's life, being taken with them on their vacation, going with them into hospital rooms when they are ill, sitting down with them in the quiet hours when their children are sleeping or when they're taking care of elderly parents, and being integrated into somebody's life as a trusted companion, whether you're aware that you've gone along with them or not. It's an honor to be included in other people's lives.
Wow, I'm so glad to see everybody here today. Welcome to the Ames Reading Series here in the Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors at Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Diane Wilson. I'm the curator of our collection up here, and I'm so happy that we're back in the Heritage Room for an in-person event. This program is being recorded, and it'll be available on the library's YouTube channel, along with an interview that we conducted earlier this afternoon. For those not familiar with our service, the Heritage Room's mission is to preserve and promote works by and about Nebraska authors. It's funded by an endowment supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, which was established through the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. We're really grateful for their help because it makes events like this possible. The Ames Reading Series serves as a venue for authors to share their works with our community, and this is the 226th program since its beginning in 1985. Today, we're delighted to host New York Times bestselling author Tosca Lee. Her 11 novels include The Line Between, The Progeny, and The Legend of Sheba. Tosca's work has been translated into 17 languages and optioned for TV and film. She's the recipient of multiple awards, including 2 International Book Awards and Nebraska Book Award honors. Her work has been praised by Publishers Weekly, Midwest Book Review, and many other publications as deeply human, powerful, and mind-bending historical fiction. Tosca serves on the board of directors of International Thriller Writers and is a featured presenter and guest of honor at writers' conferences and literary events throughout the world. She earned her bachelor's degree in English from Smith College and is a former Fortune Global 500 consultant with the Gallup organization. She's a former Mrs. Nebraska and first runner-up to Mrs. United States. So please help me welcome Tosca Lee.
Thank you, Diane. Also, Thank you, Austin, who's filming for us today. Please get the good angle. I appreciate that. Thank you for having me. I have a lot of writer friends and family here today, so it's really cool and very moving and also very emotional to be able to look out and see faces that you know and recognize, and I really, really appreciate it. And if you want to know some of my author-writer friends who are in the audience afterwards, I would love to introduce you to them. So, can you hear me okay? All right. My little sister, Amy, knew what she wanted to do with her life from a very young age. She wanted to be a doctor from the time that she was a toddler. I'll never forget, she had her little doll and she brought it to me and she said, "She has a confusion." And I didn't know if that was supposed to be a concussion or a contusion or what. But I have very fond memories of her sewing up the Thanksgiving turkey with dental floss. Actually, it wasn't very fun because I kind of thought it was gross. But she had her little scrubs cap on and everything, and she knew early on that she wanted to be a physician, and that is what she is today. And she teaches medical school at Tufts in Boston. I did not know I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a ballerina from a very young age, and so I grew up with my parents carting me back and forth to Omaha, where I danced with different companies, including the Omaha Ballet Company. Up until I was a teenager when I had an injury, and it became apparent to me that maybe this ballet thing wasn't going to work out, and I should look into doing something else. I'd always loved writing as a kid. I always loved stories. I was the one who, actually, I didn't want to go see Star Wars when it first came out. My parents made me go see that. But after I saw it, I was addicted to Star Wars, and I was fully convinced that Luke Skywalker was coming for me. And so stories were very alive and vibrant to me from a really young age. I think that's part of what I loved about ballet, is telling stories on the stage. And back in the day, before we had the Lead Center, remember that? I used to perform the Nutcracker at the Playhouse. And that was always the funnest part of being a ballerina, was telling the stories, even if you had no words to say them with. So I went off to college. I went to Smith College. Patty Beitler is here. She's a fellow Smith alum. And I remember thinking I'd go into business or something like that. Somebody, one of my parents at some point said, maybe you should go into advertising. And I was like, okay. Or maybe you should become a news anchor. And I was like, okay, I can try that. But it was spring break, my freshwoman, Smith is all female, my freshwoman year. I came back for spring break. I'm the only person I know who goes to Nebraska on their spring break. That was me. I came home. And I was in a car with my dad. And I don't know where we were going, but we were talking about books. I was talking about one of my favorite books of all time. And I was talking about how a great novel is like a roller coaster with its twists and turns and occasional loops. And that day I just blurted it out and I just said, you know what, I think I want to write a book. And I had spent the summer before working for NBC Bank. Do you guys remember NBC? It was over there somewhere. I was not a good teller. I do not have a good brain for numbers, could not balance my drawer, not good with names and faces. This guy came in once and I was like, gosh, he looks familiar. Who is that? And I finally looked down at his deposit slip and it was Tom Osborne. It was like that guy from TV. So anyway, that day, Dad said, okay, Tosca, I'll make you a deal and I will pay you what you would have made working at the bank a second summer if you write your first novel, do it full time, and treat it like a job. And that was a no-brainer. I was like, yes, I'm totally in. I totally forgot that Dad had signed me up to go study at Oxford for the first part of the summer. Economics, more numbers. So I planned on that. I came back with a suitcase full of books about Stonehenge, and then I set about writing my epic Neolithic historical novel about the people of Stonehenge in 2 months. And I remember sitting down to do this. This was 1989, and I had what we called affectionately a transportable computer because it was suitcase-sized, but you could move it. And it was a suitcase-sized thing, but had a little screen about this big with a little flashing DOS prompt. Do you remember that? And it was WordStar. Do you remember that? Okay, that was back in the day. Anyway, I remember sitting down to write this thing and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing, because there's no real way to learn how to write a novel until you actually sit down and write it. And so I did. I sat down, I wrote it, and it wasn't very good. And the following summer, I decided I should try to get a big New York agent for my novel, because I've got this thing, and the next step is to get it published, of course. And so I wrote to Writer's House, which is still one of the premier New York agencies. And so I wrote to this woman who I recently learned is still agenting. I will not approach her, I'm still scared. But I wrote to her, and I finally heard back. Now remember, this is back in the day when you have to send your query letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope so they can reject you on your dime, right? And then if they really want to read your book, you print the whole thing out and you send it in a Kinko's box. It's a whole ream of paper. Again, with enough postage that they can send it back to you, or a note that they can dump it if they don't want it. So I sent it off. Months later, I got this letter from the poor soul who had to read the slush pile for Writer's House. I found it not too long ago, and it goes like this. Dear Miss Lee, even after reading the 23-page synopsis, never write a 23-page synopsis. If you're a writer, if you're in here, don't do that. Just one or two. Otherwise, you don't even deserve a letter like I got. Even after reading the 23-page synopsis, we're still not sure what this novel is about. Your plot lacks tension. Your characters are two-dimensional. But it is strangely reminiscent of Clan of the Cave Bear, which, do you remember that book? One of my favorite novels growing up. So what I took away from that rejection letter was, my book is like Clan of the Cave Bear, and I should totally do this again. So that began my literary journey in 1989. So my very first novel was a book called Demon, a memoir, and that one was actually, I think, my third novel that I ever wrote. And I wrote it around the end of the 90s, and I wrote it in about 3 months, and I thought, the angels have sung, and this is meant to be, and so I sent it off trying to get it published, and 6 years later, finally got it published. I got an agent along the way, mostly because I wore her down. I wrote to her and said, hey, would you like to take me on? I sent my thing somewhere else and nobody responded. And she said, well, I can try to find out what happened to that. And I said, does this mean you're going to be my agent? And she said, okay. So that's how I got my agent. And that first book was Demon, a memoir. And it came out, and when the publisher bought it, this interesting thing happened. They said, hey, what else have you got? And I said, I have this thing, hold on. And I looked in my drawer, and I had this fringed notebook page that I had torn out at one point. And I had written the very beginning of a story about a very old Eve about to tell her life story near the end of her life. It was just one page. And I'd shoved it in the drawer, and I took it out, and I said, I have this. And they said, great, we'll take it, and we'll take one more. And I said, I don't have one more. And they said, you'll think of something. So that was the very beginning of my journey. And come on in. One of my high school friends is here with her kids. So great to see everybody. So I wrote the story of Eve while I was working for the Gallup organization and traveling on planes. And I was younger then, and I had more stamina for those things. So I was able to edit on planes and be in hotel rooms. And that third book, I wasn't quite sure what that would be. But after doing the story of Eve, it was an editor who said to me, why don't you write the story of Judas Iscariot? And I remember thinking, I'm not touching that story with a 10-foot pole. It's too hard. And I was working for Gallup, and I was in New York City, and I went to a restaurant. I ate often by myself, and I was sitting at a restaurant, and it was one of those restaurants where the tablecloth, they have the tablecloth, but then they have paper, you know what I mean, on top of the tablecloth. And that's irresistible to someone like me if you have a pen, right? I'm not alone, right? Okay. Okay. So I was sitting there eating my dinner after a day of consulting. And at one point I looked down and I had framed out the scene between a young Judas Iscariot and his mother. And we never think of Judas as having ever been a boy or having ever had a mother. And I remember thinking, oh no, I'm doomed. So I tore it off and I shoved it in my bag and I called my agent a few days later and I said, okay, there's this terrible idea. And he said, I can't think of anyone better to write it, which was not the response I was looking for. So I went to a few other people, a few other author friends, and said, okay, terrible idea. And they all failed me similarly. And so eventually I took that book on. That book was 5 years of my life. And I spent the first year and a half researching it full time, like a job, as my dad had taught me. And then I started to write, and I traveled also to Israel with the Biblical Archaeology Society, worked on that book, and that was a book that really changed my life. Not just because, ironically, it went on to win a Christian Book of the Year award the next year, but because I was writing this book. I write in first person a lot, and I go into those books telling myself, I am this person. So I went into that one saying, you're a first century Jewish man, you're a first century Jewish man. And somewhere a third of the way into that book, I realized as Judas was in the midst of his activism, and as he was struggling with the political plight of his people, and as he was angry at the way that God was responding and disillusioned by the way his friend was acting and by the way that he thought things should be going, that I wasn't writing his story anymore. I was writing my story. And so it became very personal. And one other important thing happened to me with the writing of that book. I had been so scared because there are people who spend their entire lives researching first century Israel. And I was so cowed by this idea that I had really gone in head over heels. And so I had actually acquired a whole new bookshelf for all my new materials. And I had experts in my back pocket that I could call upon. And the first draft of that book, with all the cool informational stuff that I researched and learned, was over 800 pages. It was over 217,000 words, which for a novel is pretty long. It's kind of the equivalent of a 23-page synopsis. So, but when I was in Israel, I hadn't finished writing the book. I just had this monster of a manuscript. And the last few days, after having been in Galilee, after having been in the synagogue in Capernaum, after having been to all the places, I finally went up to Jerusalem, and I was headed up toward the Dome of the Rock, which is that beautiful gold dome. And I was very emotional, and I remember thinking that I hadn't had that moment, that, moment in this land that so many religions call home. And I was going up the steps, and there was an old beggar woman there with very leathery skin. And as I came toward her, I reached into my back pocket for what I had there, and it was just a few shekels. But when I leaned down to give it to her, she grabbed my hand. And in that moment of connection, I realized it's not about the steeples on the horizon, and it's not about how much you know, and it's not about all the learning, and that the story, like the relationship, is all right there in that moment between you and somebody else. And that moment changed my life in that book because it reminded me that the heart of a story is about human connection and relationship. So I went back and I threw out hundreds of pages of research, the look how smart I am stuff, and went back to the heart of the story. And then I will never forget this. I lived in the preserve up until I got married. My husband's over there in the black shirt. Normally he'd be in a combine right now, but so I was dating my husband, and I was at home in my house in the preserve around 80th and Pioneers. I had a villa, a townhome there, and I was doing what I did as a single author. I was eating soggy nachos from Amigos on the floor in front of my TV, which was kind of my favorite thing to do, actually. I just loved it. And I got a text from my publisher, and he said, Iscariot just won the gold medallion, which was Christian Book of the Year. And I'm like, really, a book about Judas did? And then he sent me a picture of the award, and he's like, look, and I was like, that's great. Do I get that, or do you keep it? And they did finally send it to me. So that book was an incredible journey for me. Another incredible journey followed after that because I decided I was ready to take on a female perspective and write about the Queen of Sheba, who we talk about, and we have cat food named after, but which of us really knows that much about her? And I thought, this is going to be so easy because I just researched all this stuff and I went to Israel. No, it wasn't. It wasn't at all, because she lived 1,000 years before the time of Christ. So back to the drawing board. And then something happened while I was working on this book. A friend of mine texted me one night and said, I never see you. Why don't you come out and meet me? Let's go to the grotto over at 70th and A, right catty corner from Lincoln East, where I went to school. And I was like, nope, I'm going to work and do my stuff and eat my soggy nachos. And she said, come on, it's Saturday night. And I was like, oh, real people go out on Saturday night, I guess. So I did decide I would go out. We went out together. We're at the place together, and I'm wearing Uggs and tattered jeans and all this. And I see this guy sitting at this restaurant in the middle of two other guys, and he's the most handsome man I've ever seen in my life. My eyes literally did the ooga, ooga cartoon thing. And I told my friend, you see that guy over there? And so they came up with this plan to send him a drink with my card, which only has my website on it. Not my address, not my phone number, my website with professionally retouched photos that looked way better than I looked that night. And so we sent the drink and we ran away, and that was that, and I felt really stupid until I got an email 6 days later and struck up a friendship with a farmer from south of Fremont. And so while I was writing this book called The Legend of Sheba, about the Queen of Sheba, I was falling in love. And I wrote parts of that book at the farmhouse where I now call home. And so Brian, when that book came out, we were at Barnes & Noble. Jen was in here. Jen, no, different Jen, yeah. This is my friend Jen from high school. Jen, the librarian, was a manager at Barnes & Noble over at South Point, and she was there and took a picture when that book came out, and Brian proposed to me at that book signing at Barnes & Noble. So that was a very special book of my heart. My journey went a different direction after that when I decided to write some thrillers. I wanted to do something a little different. This historical stuff was great, but it's a lot of work. And I wanted to see if I could keep readers up past midnight, because I really love it when readers write to me and say, I skipped school, I called into work sick. I mean, not that I'm advocating for that, but I kind of am, because whenever I hear that, I silently put a notch in my belt and high-five myself. So I thought I want to write some thrillers and see if I can keep readers up past midnight. So I decided I would write the story about the descendants of true historical Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Have you heard of her? They call her the Blood Countess, Hollywood does at least, because she's rumored to be the most prolific female serial killer of all time. And she is a real person. So off I went, the way that I love to do, off to Croatia and Hungary and Italy and all those places to research her. It was so much fun. I took my mom with me, did the research, wrote these books, and somewhere during the process of writing about her modern day descendants and underground stuff and secret societies and, all the kind of fun things, my mother, who's a lifelong genealogist, said, well, we're distantly related to her. And I was like, what? We're distantly related to Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. So that was something kind of weird that happened. Well, the next thing I thought I would do after that was that I would start a new duology, the first book of which would be called The Line Between, and I thought it'd be fun to write a pandemic duology. So this book and its sequel both came out in 2019, right before the start of COVID, and some of you know this story. The way that these two books came about was not because I had any insight into the idea that a pandemic might be on its way. I had 2 books left in a contract with Simon & Schuster, and I went out to New York with a short list of ideas, about 10. One idea was about a young woman who leaves a cult and has to start over in the outside world that she's been taught to regard as evil. And the other idea was based on a news article I had read not long before about a reindeer carcass that had thawed in Siberia and happened to be filled full of anthrax and made a nearby village sick, and a young boy died. And I remember thinking, wow, that's terrifying. And so I added it to the list and thinking that might be something interesting. And my publisher, when I got there, said, I pitched all the ideas. And he said, I like this one, and I think you should combine the two, the cult one and the Siberian, the disease one. And I remember thinking, what are you on? Because that is just not how I saw those two things coming together. But being the good little writer soldier that I am, I came home and I started writing what would eventually become The Line Between. And it is the story of a young woman whose name is Winter Roth. She's named after my stepdaughter. By the way, when I, a city girl, married my farmer husband, I now live on a farm. I'm a farm wife. I also acquired 4 children, so 4 stepchildren. So life had a plot twist I had never seen coming. And if you follow me on social media, you can see the various things that happen at the funny farm, as I like to call it. We have a 160-pound German Shepherd named Timber, and there's always something funny happening with that. There's always something funny just happening normally. I'll never forget the time I was a new farm wife, and we have twins. One of the twins came running in. He might have only been 10, 11, something like that. He came running in. He goes, Tosca, there's a turkey in the yard. And I, the city girl, thought, this will be great social media, right? So I grab my phone and I run outside and I see this thing. And even I know that this is not a turkey. It's a black chicken. And so there's black chicken in the yard, and so I call my mother-in-law, who's sitting back here, and I said, there's a chicken in the yard. What shall I do? And she's like, oh, well, it's probably one of the neighbors. You should just go catch it and put it in the dog kennel or something, and we'll figure out whose it is. And so I got off the phone, and I was like, all right, boys, go catch the chicken. And the one twin looks at me and says, I'm not touching that, but you can use my gloves. So my husband's off working, and here I am at home chasing this chicken around like Rocky Balboa. We put it in chicken jail later, and we find out that it belongs to somebody across the street. But anyway, that's been my life ever since. So if you want to see the newest adventure, there's always something going on. Anyway, in this book, I named the main character after my daughter, Winter, who is my oldest of my stepchildren. And she was also the same age as the main character in this book when I wrote it. She got married this summer. She's 26 now. Anyway, so this is the story of Winter Roth, and she has grown up in a doomsday cult in Iowa. I put the cult people in Iowa. When I go visit Iowa, they always ask me, like, why did you put the cult people here? And I'm like, really sorry. I put them north of Ames. She grows up in a doomsday cult. She eventually gets kicked out and has to start over in the outside world. And right at that time, this new epidemic is starting to spread across the U.S. And in my book, the result is that people start wearing masks, and they are told to stay home, and they are told to leave their workplaces. And there's a first hotspot that happens in Washington. And so 2020 was a really weird year for me after having written these books. That said, though, the disease in my book is a prion disease, so it's a very different situation. You go mad and then you die, so totally different. And the sequel is A Single Light, and this was really fun for me because it's the first time that I was able to set books where I live in the Midwest. So the story starts in Iowa. She ends up with a set of medical samples she has to get somewhere, Colorado in this case, so she ends up traveling through Nebraska, ends up hunkering down in western Nebraska later on. And the second book, A Single Light, picks up near Gurley. You guys know where Gurley is, near Sydney, and in an underground silo, and goes on from there. Through the process of writing the books, I blew up the sheriff's department in North Platte and burned down the hospital in Sydney. And they've still invited me to go out there and talk about the book, so they must not be too mad. I'll be taking off tomorrow, actually, for Sydney, so they must not be holding a grudge, I guess. Anyway, I thought I'd read you the first chapter, since I think I'm supposed to read. So would you like to hear the first chapter of The Line Between? Okay. There is a short little prologue wherein an Alaskan farmer of a heritage breed of pigs called Mangalitsa. This Mangalitsa ham is supposed to be really good. It's like super special gourmet stuff. I actually bought a couple of those for my dad and some other people at Christmas, and I thought I'd get to taste it, but they ate it without me. So, but it was good, right? Yeah, it was good. So anyway, in the first chapter, this Alaskan pig farmer has this heritage breed, and he's really excited about these piglets that are on the way until the day that they dig up this old part of a carcass because of the climate change in Alaska, the melting permafrost. They're able to dig up this old carcass, and it's infected with something, and that kicks the beginning of the story off. And then we switch to Iowa. So here we are, Iowa in September. Conventional wisdom dictates that there is an insurmountable divide, an entire dimension of eternity and space between heaven and hell. Lucifer managed to make the trip in 9 days, at least according to Paradise Lost. That equates to a distance of about 25,920 miles, assuming standard rules of velocity. But I can tell you it's closer to 1.5 feet, the distance of a step, give or take an inch. Magnus stands near the gatehouse, shirt sleeves rolled up, collar unbuttoned beneath his brown vest. He nods to the guardian in the booth, and the industrial gate begins its mechanical slide. There's a small door to the side of it, just large enough to admit a single person, but I won't be leaving through the narrow gate. My departure must be a spectacle, a warning to those assembled behind me. I can feel their eyes against my back like hot iron, the glares mottled by anger and fear, sadness maybe, but above all gratitude that they are not me. 2 guardians stand at my sides, ready to forcibly walk me out in case I balk or my 22-year-old legs give out beneath me. I glance at the one to my right and swear he looks impatient. Hungry, maybe. It's just before lunchtime. I'm crossing into eternal damnation, and all he's thinking about is an egg salad sandwich, and not even a good one. It's Wednesday, Sabbath by the solar calendar. Rosella's managing the kitchen, and that pious sandwich is full of chickpeas without a single real egg in it. The gate comes to a stop with an ominous clang. The road beyond us paved with gravel, a gray part in a sea of native grass, strewn with gold and purple flowers in stark contrast to the carefully and beautifully manicured grounds behind me. A meadowlark sings somewhere nearby as a combine rumbles in the distance. I grip the plastic bag of my sparse belongings, a change of underwear, my baby book stripped of its photos, a stone the color of sea glass. Sweat drips down the inside of my blouse as I stare out at that feral scape, at that barren drive through untouched prairie that leads to the road half a mile away. A car idles at the corner, waiting for me. Don't look. Don't glance back. That's pride talking. A voice so faint this last decade I wasn't aware it was still there. Still, I turn. Not because I need a parting glance at the compound I called home for the last 15 years, or even Jacqueline, my sister, but because I need to see her, my niece, truly. I scan the nearly 500 select assembled across the broad drive until I find her small form near the front, her hand in Jacqueline's, curls wafting around her head in the breeze. I'd planned to mouth the words, "I love you," to tug my right earlobe in our secret sign so she'll remember me long after she's told she can never speak my name again, to fight back tears at the sight of hers, to combat her confusion with love. Instead, my heart stops. She's glaring at me, her face pink, growing redder by the instant. I open my mouth to say what I don't know, but before I can, she tears her hand from my sister's and runs away, disappearing into the assembly. "Truly," I grasp and stagger a step after her. The guardians grab my arms. "No, wait, truly." I twist against them, plastic bag swinging against my thigh. I can't leave her like this. Not like this. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. None of it was. I shift my gaze to my sister, where she stands beside the 6 elders. Her cheeks are hollow, features chiseled far beyond her 27 years. "What did you say to her?" I shout as I'm jerked back around and hauled toward Magnus, who stands before the open gate, this side of that invisible line. "Winter Roth," Magnus says, loudly enough for those behind us to hear, which means he's basically shouting right at me. Gone the brown and gray scruff that was on his chin yesterday. I can smell his aftershave from here. "Please," I whisper in the space between us, trying to snag his gaze, but he stares past me as though I were a stranger. "Because of your deliberate, prolonged disobedience," his words carry to those behind me even as the breeze whisks mine away. "Just let me say goodbye. Including the sins of idolatry, thievery, and the willful desire to harm the eternal future of those most vulnerable among us, because you will not hear the pleas of the brethren and refuse repentance, you are hereby delivered to Satan for the destruction of your flesh." I hear the words as though from a distance. I've seen and heard them spoken before. I just never thought they'd be aimed at me. So this is it. There will be no goodbyes, and I realize I hate him. Magnus lifts up his hands. "And so we renounce your fellowship and cast you out of our holy number, even as we pray for the restoration of your salvation, which you forfeit this day. Now, as it is bound on earth, so let it be bound in heaven." He lowers his arms as the assembly echoes his words and says, more quietly as he meets my eyes at last, "You have broken our hearts, Winter." He moves away before I can respond, and the guardians walk me to the line as I glance back one last time. But Truly's gone. I face the gravel drive before me. One step, that's all it takes to span the distance of eternity. Welcome to hell. So that's the first chapter of that. I was really worried during the pandemic that nobody would want to read a story about a pandemic. And oddly, people still did. So I was very honored that this book and A Single Light each won an International Book Award and the Nashville Silver Falchion and some other things. After that, I wasn't quite sure, but I had a friend who had invited me to collaborate with him on a World War II book about a chapter of history that I had not known about, and that is the Bataan Death March. And so the last few years I've been working on a book called The Long March Home with World War II biographer Marcus Brotherton. And it is the story of 3 teenage best friends from Mobile, Alabama, who joined the Army in 1941, are stationed in the Philippines, and are there when Pearl Harbor is attacked. And then right after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Philippines were attacked as well. And they are at Clark Field and Fort Stotzenberg when they get bombed. And they are plunged into war. And so it's the story of these three best friends as they are fighting and defending the Bataan Peninsula, fighting against terrible odds without enough medicine, without enough food, sick with dysentery, sick with malaria, starving. And eventually they are taken prisoner in the largest American surrender in history. And they are marched 60 miles to a prisoner camp. And so this is their story. It is inspired by true survivor accounts. And the story goes back and forth between the present day for them as they are fighting to survive and back earlier in their childhood, showing how they became best friends and how they bonded. Billy, Hank, and Jimmy. Jimmy is the main character. And it also includes their bond with one other best friend, which is Claire, who is Billy's sister, and whom the other two boys are in love with. So it has a little bit of romance. It has a lot of grit. It was a very difficult and grueling book to research. And that book comes out in May next year. And so I do have bookmarks and postcards for that book that I just received from my new publisher. And I'm really excited and very honored to be telling a story about the heroic defenders of Bataan. So that's the new one. And after that, because, I can't do the same thing for too long, which drives agents crazy, by the way. They really just want you to kind of write the same thing all the time. But, I don't like to eat sushi every day, and I don't like to eat hamburgers every day either. So my next story will be a medieval thriller about the European witch hunts. And because why not? So I think that's really about all I've got to share with you, unless you've got some questions for me. Yeah, Patty.
Can you talk a bit about collaborating on a book and how you do that when are you writing, and is he approving, or is he suggesting, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've done 2 collaborations now. I wrote a trilogy with Ted Decker, and that was the one that was set 500 years in the future, so that's a dystopian one. And that was very different than my collaboration with Marcus, who I worked on The Long March Home with. As far as I can tell, and I have a lot of friends who also collaborate, no partnership is exactly the same, and everybody does it a little different. When I wrote with Ted, we brainstormed the entire trilogy together, brainstormed the first book together, and I took the lead on the first draft. And so I would write 90 to 95% of that book, and he would come in and rewrite it, and then I would rewrite his stuff. And we did it because we were trying to create a fine lacquer with layer after layer after layer. And we had to because he came in from writing serial killer thrillers, and I had just written this kind of more literary tale about Eve, this biblical fiction. And after we were done, by the way, Ted went on to write biblical fiction, and I went on to write about the descendants of a serial killer. So, we kind of went like that. Ted's name, Ted is a big bestseller. And so for me, partnering with him when we had moments of disagreement, I generally deferred to what his choice was. We had our moments. I was still writing largely at night, which I used to do a lot. I used to write until 3, 4, 5, 6. My dad and stepmom lived right on the back of my block, and so a lot of times I'd finish work at 6:30, 7 in the morning, and I'd call them and be like, "What have you got for breakfast?" And I'd go over there and eat. And whenever I finish a book, I always, for some reason, finish at 7:30 in the morning, and so I'd always go over there. But anyway, I'd write through the night. And Ted would be sleeping through the night, and he'd get up the next day while I was sleeping and start reading what I had done, and then we'd hash through it, discuss what had to happen next. And I'll never forget this one time we had discussed what had to happen in this chapter, and as I'm writing it, sometimes you just realize that certain things need to happen, because even though you planned it one way, but when you're down in there, it's got to go a different way. Because you can look at it 30,000 feet, up in the air, but when your boot's on the ground, it's different. So I wrote the chapter. I was really happy with it. And the next day I get this call from Ted, and he's like, "You killed Tryphon. You like killed this character." And I was like, "Yeah, it was his time, man. Let him go." And he was like, he's like, that's not what we discussed. I'm like, "I know, but like when you get in there, that's just," and so then we had to figure out this compromise, and so that's how that worked. Our second book, he took half of the first draft, and I did half of the first draft. And the third book, he took most of the first draft, and then I would come in and rewrite. With Marcus contacted me having done a first draft that wasn't quite working or wasn't quite where it needed to be, and he felt like he needed a female perspective and some other things. And so I took his draft and added on a whole beginning to the story, and went in and pulled some wires out and redid it, and so totally different. And we still have our moments where he'll say, "You know what, I feel very strongly we need to keep this or change this or do that." And I had a moment or two also where I was like, "It's got to be like this and I'll fight you." So, we have those. I'm really pleased with the partnership, though, and Marcus is a great guy, and he's done some tremendous work on his subjects, mostly nonfiction, and really excited for this book. Hi, Joe.
Yeah, if you had a room full of 15-year-old high school sophomores who wanted to be writers, what advice would you give them?
Yeah.
About being a writer, finding stories, how to get from beginning to middle to end, what role inspiration plays, how do you stay inspired? What advice would you give 15-year-old sophomore would-be writers?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you have to read a lot of what you love. And you have to read widely, but you have to especially read a lot of what you love and what you want to write. I think that's important. I think inspiration is important. I think it's great but you can find inspiration. I find it from movies. I find it from, other things, not necessarily just books, but there comes a point when inspiration kind of leaves you for the day too. And it's time to just sit your butt in the chair and do the work. And I'll be honest, there isn't a day that I sit down to write where I'm like, woohoo, I'm feeling super inspired. I usually sit down and I squirm around like a toddler for about 40 minutes, and I'll pick my cuticles and look out the window and decide I'm hungry and whatever else. And somewhere around that 40-minute period, things will start to kick into gear. So there comes a point where it's just, if you want it bad enough, you're going to do it. And I think that's really what separates those who have longevity in the end. And, when I teach, and I do teach writing quite a bit, the thing I always say is you've got to get to the end, because if you want a career in this, as you know, you've got to finish, and you've got to finish over and over and over. And that's one of the hardest things to do. My second novel, I never finished. I rewrote it over and over for 9 years. And so I have just a few rules when it comes to writing. The first is write like no one will ever read it. And that is because that's how you maintain that audacity and moxie that you bring to the page before you're published and before you're worried about being reviewed and critiqued. That's something I try to tell myself even now when I'm contracted and I've got a movie option or whatever. I try to tell myself I'm going to write this like I'm in my closet with my flashlight and my secret notebook writing secret stuff, because that's how you get the good stuff. And then my second rule is get the clay on the wheel. And all that means is you can't crimp the edges and make it pretty until you've got that messy lump of poop-looking clay on the wheel. And that's the only way you're going to finish. And I don't like mess. I don't like stuff out of order. My great joy in writing is going in and editing and making it pretty. I just love that part. But you got to get the mess out and get the clay on the wheel. So those are my first two things. And then I have some other things too, like you have to go with your strengths. You've got to do what you're strong at, do what you're good at, concentrate on honoring the way that you work best, however that is, whether it's to music or silence or late at night or you have a critique group or whatever it is. But those are kind of my main ones. I also believe in having a philosophy about rejection, because you get rejected a lot when you do this. Nobody's ever going to grow a thick skin if you don't already have one. And so I just believe you have a philosophy about getting rejected, and you just understand if you hear the same thing over and over, maybe that's worth taking into consideration, but also if people are mean to you, that they're telling you more about themselves than your work.
How do you feel about having something put on the screen that you've written and how much control that you're going to have over how that shows up?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You give up your control over it after a certain point, and so you hope that you have people who can honor the spirit of the story. That said, I really don't mind it very much. I created a playground, and if other people want to go expand on that and play there, I had a friend who's a New York Times bestselling author ask me once about the progeny. There's one of those over there and one there. Hey, look, would you be open to having other progeny stories about these descendants of Elizabeth Bathory, written? I'd love to write one and set it in your universe. And I'm like, that's great, come play on my playground. And Simon & Schuster said no. So that put the kibosh on it, but I loved that idea. I'm excited to see the story in capable other hands. I've seen the pilot script now of the progeny. I've watched it go through different iterations and seen the notes along the way, and it's really fascinating. I'm taking a stab at writing a pilot myself because I'm working with a TV producer on The Legend of Sheba. He tried to get somebody else. Everybody was busy, and he was like, well, do you want to do it? And I was like, I know the source material. So I'm working on that, and it's a whole different ball of wax. Really totally different from novel writing. And I think it's exciting. And, if it happens, you get paid, so that's nice, too. So...
When you're writing, when you embark upon a novel, do you pretty much know what's going to happen throughout the story, or are you oftentimes surprised?
Yeah, I have learned that I need to have an outline, and that's just one of those things about honoring how you work best. And I will never legislate style when I teach writing. I really encourage writers to learn themselves and to get to know themselves well enough to do it the way that's best for them. For myself, this book, I have friends who are very successful pantsers. So they write by the seat of their pants. When I started this book, having outlined my entire life, I thought, this is innate, right? How many of these have I done? I can just sit down and start diving in, right? It was a giant disaster. So I sent it in. My editor sent it back with they send you a letter when you get your, first feedback. It's a letter telling you, diplomatically, well, I really liked your character. It's really nice to meet this character. This is very fascinating. Here's everything that's wrong. Boom, 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 boom. And so when I got the letter, I realized nothing was working quite right. And I had to go pull all the wires out. And it delayed publication by a whole season for this book. And then I had to dive right into a single light right away. And that was not good either, because what's the first thing you think I did? Made an outline, but my confidence was very low. And when you're writing a story like, a novel, you have to have a certain amount of confidence because you're the god of that world and you need to go in feeling secure. And I didn't, and it took me writing that whole book to get my mojo back and get to the point where I was cackling maniacally every now and then. So, wait, what was the original question? Something about how you'd start. Oh, yes. So for me, I always start with an outline. It's a very loose outline. It's more like a list of events. But then I leave room for mystery, and I leave room for things to happen. So when I went in and started writing a single light, boom, doing the outline, learned my lesson. I am not a pantser, and I'm not like my friends who do that. But I knew that I needed to meet a character in Gurley, Nebraska, and that he would come along and take this journey with my main character. What I didn't know is that he'd be this nonverbal guy named Otto. And Otto, even though he doesn't speak, was hilarious. And he became my favorite character I've ever written, actually. And so these things just kind of happen, as you know, when you're writing that you didn't quite plan for, but they pop up. And that's like one of the payoffs of writing, because you can't plan for all those things, and you can't get those things until you get in the trenches and do it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Did you ever run the combine with your husband?
That would be such a disaster. I sit in the jump seat. I don't even know if it's called a jump seat, but I sit in the one, and it's got a refrigerator underneath it. So, and I take video, and I bring sandwiches. So that's how I contribute to the farming.
Farming 25 miles north south of here.
No, you did.
And 22, I come in the winter. So I was way back in 71.
In 71.
Red Creek. Sure interesting.
Thank you. I'd be scared to run the combine now. There's so many computers and
No, how
all
long have
stuff.
you been married?
I've been married for 6 years now. So we met that fateful night at the Grotto was in 2013. And after we struck up this conversation, we wanted to go out on a date, but I went on tour for Iscariot, and I was on tour off and on for a whole month. And so then we were finally able to go on our first date, and that was it. We were in love, and he proposed when my next book came out. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Jennifer has a cousin who's written a couple of books about the Band of Brothers.
Oh,
And I'm aware of the death rate of World War II veterans, so many, hundreds per day almost. And I wondered how much of your information gathering on Bataan was from living survivors and how much it was just, paper research.
yeah. So unfortunately, so much of it, the research that was from living survivors is from recorded interviews, but the bulk of it came from interviews that have been published, and also, and this is such a great resource, and I'm so glad they did it. Also, the self-written, self-published accounts of survivors, and so. They're not always, professionally edited, or they're not always whatever. But I'm so happy that these survivors did put their accounts into writing, largely probably for their families. But I was lucky enough to acquire several of these, and the amount of detail is astounding in some of these accounts. And these survivors, many of them who wrote those accounts are no longer with us, but they were in their 90s or whatever, and their detail is just incredible. So unfortunately, most of it came from their self-published accounts. And also, there's a fabulous book called Death March by Knox is the author's name, and it contains many, many, many interviews. And it's that was a huge resource as well.
Do you find it harder to write the characters or the plot?
Oh,
Some books are so character-driven, and some are so plot-driven that
yeah. One of my friends, J.D. Barker, who now writes with James Patterson, that up-and-coming guy, J.D. says that plot is character in motion. And I think that's true, because plot happens because of the decisions your characters make, and sometimes things that happen to them, but also, by and large, the decisions they make. I really like slipping into the skin of my characters. That's why I write in first person so much, and taking that journey, building that roller coaster that I first told my dad that a great book is like, And when I took that first book journey, the idea was maybe I can build a roller coaster that somebody else can enjoy. And so I slip into somebody else's skin and I build the roller coaster screaming and peeing my pants first. Okay.
Well, I'm just here, Tosca, to thank you
Oh,
for
thank
being
you so
here
much.
today with our little Heritage
Oh,
Room
thank you
commemorative
very
mug.
much.
So
Thank you very
so
much. I appreciate that.